Hello everyone, welcome back to another Live at 5 tour. I am your host, the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research Associate Curator, Kevin Adkisson. And today, I am delighted to be broadcasting to you from Cranbrook Gardens. And today's Live at 5 tour is done in cooperation with my friends over at the Cranbrook House and Gardens Auxiliary, who are the volunteers who dutifully maintain the 40 acres of gardens around Cranbrook House. And the gardens are open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day, so you can come and take a walk around and enjoy the sculpture and statuary and all of the plants and trees, especially as the world begins to change colors here. There are some garden tours. They've all sold out for this year, but I'm sure there will be more soon. And so I thought that my little Live at 5 Facebook tour of the gardens would really be an overview, the history of how this special place came about, and then some of my favorite features that we see at the estate. So I decided to come down and get started below the house to talk some about the early history of the house and gardens. I love the way that when you take this sort of lakeside path, the house appears and disappears behind the foliage. And then just on the side of this road, we see the beautiful Kingswood Lake, Glastonbury Lake, originally called. And with all of this lovely natural sort of wilderness here, you might be pressured to think, or you might be led to think, that all of this is sort of was found, this bucolic beauty into which the Booth family built their house. But you, my friends, would be wrong, for this is very much a man-made landscape, a contrived landscape that was built over the past 116 years. And it started as it was settled first by white settlers in the 1830s, and it was made up of a number of different farms. And so when George Booth and his wife, Ellen Scripps Booth, sort of decided to get a place up north, they came 3 hours north of the city of Detroit, and they bought a number of different farms, cobbled them together until they had about 225 acres of really hard scrapple farmland. There was nothing going on here. In Mr. Booth's own words, he bought a site that was, the corn couldn't grow because of damp, the fishery lost all of its fish in floods, the farm animals were just completely wild, including chickens that were hanging out in the orchard trees. And then the orchard itself, which had pear trees and peach trees and apple trees and some grapevines as well, they were all so poorly producing that he could only get $100 worth of fruit each year and only enough apples to make pies for the family. So it was really not a piece of land that one would want. And he decides, he looks out over this property and he thinks about what are the values that are most important to him. And he says, I'm going to turn this into a sort of gentleman's ornamental farm. And the idea of having an ornamental farm is a very modern idea. It started in the 18th century in France. Thomas Jefferson was a huge fan of ornamental farms, which were essentially very wealthy people who not necessarily play-acted farm, but instead of needing a farm for their livelihood, they ran farms as these sort of passion projects on the side, and they appreciated the aesthetics of farming and owning a farm. Thomas Jefferson, of course, builds Monticello, which was in its own way a sort of site of architecture and ornamental farm and slavery, of course. George Booth has in mind that he will do something similar. He'll keep his business, newspapers in Detroit, and then in the country, he'll run a farm. And he turns to a Englishman, H.J. Corfield, to help plan how he will transform this piece of worthless ground, a bad farm, into a productive farm. And so Corfield arrives here in 1905. He had already planned many estates out east around Boston, and he had visions. I'm trying to decide which way I want to go. I'll go straight. Corfield had visions of turning this little hill into both the site of the Booth family home, but then surrounding it by terraced gardens in the Italianate style. And the Italianate garden style was very much in vogue around 1905, starting with Charles Platt in 1896 when he published a book on the Italian garden, and then with Edith Wharton, starting in the early 1900s. She was writing a series of articles for House Beautiful that praised the way Italian mansions in Tuscany's were sort of surrounded by terraced hill gardens. And so, with Corfield's assistance, George Booth and Corfield began terracing off the hill. And so we're seeing those terraces now as the house comes into view. And these terraces were built using the local granite. And so these are all, you're looking at literally part of the problem of trying to make this a farm, which was that all of these little rocks were in the soil around the house. And so Mr. Booth gathers together the rocks and he begins using them to build the terraces. Now, George Booth had his planner, Mr. Corfield. He needed to have the labor to actually work on this transformation. And for that, he hires an Italian immigrant, Mike Vitrino. And the Vitrinos get here in 1905, and they were really close collaborators with Corfield in the labor and design of the Cranbrook Gardens. Now, the Vitrinos will continue to work at Cranbrook all the way into the 2010s. Mike Vitrino himself worked here from 1905 until 1958, and then generations of the Vitrinos lived and worked at Cranbrook for over a century. So Corfield is responsible for laying out some of the terraces. He's responsible for laying out the roads onto the property. And then Corfield was also a horticulturalist, so he advises many of the plantings. But what I think we can thank Corfield for most of all was for suggesting to George Booth, look, you can either have a gentleman's estate or you can have a productive working farm, but you cannot have both. And so Corfield suggests that to George Booth around 1908 or thereabouts. And George Booth, who has at this point already built a farm, he has a working farm, he was growing rye and oats and corn, continues to hold on to the idea that he'll be a farmer all the way up until 1922 when he closes the farm to focus on the institutions, Christ Church, the School for Boys, Kingswood, the Art Academy, and the Science Institute. And so we have the farming going on, but George Booth is now much more interested in the planting and the estate. And he hires his sort of second great figure in the landscape history of Cranbrook. And I think maybe we can see as I get a little higher, I'll keep walking through the garden and sort of turning the camera around to just appreciate some of the views as the leaves start to change. The next gentleman who comes onto the scene to work for George and Ellen as a designer was a Michigan man, Ossian Cole Simmons. And O.C. Simmons had studied architecture at the University of Michigan with William Lebrun-Gini, who some of you will recognize that name as being the father of the skyscraper. And so Gini was the dean at the University of Michigan when Simmons graduated. They end up both working in Chicago. And as Simmons is working as an architect, he begins focusing on landscape architecture. He actually called himself a landscape gardener, not a landscape architect, because he thought that a landscape architect was too harsh and technical, and he viewed himself as almost like a landscape painter. So he used the term landscape gardener. In around 1916, Simmons begins planting the forest around Cranbrook, starting with the pine forest around the Greek Theater. In 1922, he plants thousands of trees all around the estate, and he converts much of what had been the sort of never too productive farmland into forest. And so his main planting was sugar maples, and he planted those sugar maples all around the ridges so that when George Booth was here in Cranbrook House, and he would look out across his estate, he would see the sugar maples begin to turn first, and their bright color would sort of highlight all the ridges of the property. Now, how much of Simmons' forest planting survives? I'm not sure, but he is responsible for transforming it from sort of farmland to forest land. And Simmons was part of the Prairie School of Landscape Design. So he was interested in native plants, natural materials, and in using the found topography. And so all of these terraces probably were not Simmons' cup of tea, but he works with what he's given. And he thinks of Cranbrook House as being a sort of arts and crafts garden. And so the arts and crafts landscape movement would tell us that from the rooms inside of our Albert Kahn Arts and Crafts mansion, the gardens directly outside the door should be formal terraces and should be like little rooms themselves. And so the gardens closest to the house are kept quite tight and quite manicured. And the farther away you get from the house, the more wild and free the gardens are. Now, Simmons was publishing his own philosophies in places like House Beautiful and the Sketchbook, and he promoted a landscape philosophy of crabs and haws, crab apples and hawthorns for their horizontal lines. And here at Cranbrook, he's really, I think, gives us the gift of fall color because he was very interested in Michigan's native trees that would change colors over the years. Now, George Booth and his children would continue to work on the house throughout their parents' lives, throughout George's life. And then the children, especially Henry Booth, would continue to shape the campus. So, for instance, this flagpole here was a gift in the 1960s from the grandchildren. Other places where we see the children's influence, this low wall here, which was built and then the house could not see the water behind it. It couldn't see towards the lake. And so a couple of the sons took out their sledgehammers. They knocked a hole in the wall while George and Ellen were on vacation. When they get back, George Booth sort of huffs and puffs and berates them for demolishing his lovely terraced wall, and then says, but if you're going to make a hole to see the water, make it large enough where I can really see the water. So then they have to take even more of the terrace down. So it was always a work in progress. And as it progresses, George and Ellen Booth begin buying more things for the garden. So including things like this little bird bath with the bronze putti, our little angel figure from the Renaissance that's a 19th century copy here. And the spirit of adding things to the garden has continued. And so all the way into the 1980s, we see here by Richard Robinson, a little ginkgo sundial that I quite love. And I believe Robinson is a graduate of the metalsmithing department at the Art Academy. Now, the gardens are, as I mentioned, maintained entirely by volunteers. I'm not a plant person, so I'm not really sure what all we're looking at. But each of these little areas are maintained by different gardeners who sort of tend to them year round. The hosta collection over here. And then we see this little pavilion here, which was originally an outdoor picnic area. It became a sculpture studio for the Czechoslovakian-American sculptor Mario Kobel. It has another Richard Robinson 1980s little weather vane on top. And again, today's tour is just an overview, so we're just sort of hitting the highlights of the gardens. As we turn here, on the 50th anniversary of the purchase of the property in 1954, Henry Booth oversaw the conversion of this valley into what was known as Daffodil Hill, the golden anniversary of Cranbrook. Gold and daffodils were run all through the valley and I know many of us miss Daffodil Hill. Here we see more of Simmons' ideas of the trees and how he sort of highlights with fall color. And he backdrops this wonderful fountain, which was purchased by the Booths in Rome, or maybe in Florence, I'm not sure, in 1922. And this fountain is known as the Turtle Fountain. It's one of 6 copies that are around the country. There's one in San Francisco, one in Sarasota at the Ringling. And it is a fountain that was first sculpted in 1585 in Rome by Giacomo della Porta and Taddeo Landini. In 1658, there had been dolphins here, but they were too heavy and they were out of balance visually and physically. And so Bernini sculpted these precious turtles and added them. And so this is really a landmark sculpture in the history of Renaissance art because of the way the pose that these young men hold. They're sort of contrapposto leaning. If you were to actually try and get yourself into that pose, the proportions are really quite different from real life. And so the artist is sculpting them based visually what looks best versus anatomically what is correct. And it has these really amazing dolphins that are shooting out into the shell base and then this huge pool down at the bottom. And the gardens, all of the fountains at Cranbrook are being turned off for the entire tour season in order to save money during this unusual pandemic year. Now, on this side of the terrace, we see a group of sculptures, the seasons. And so who do we have here? I believe that this is summer, and then winter with her grapes, and then, oh no, winter with the shroud here, fall with the wheat, so that must be summer with the grapes. And so it's the 4 seasons, and they are surrounding a ornamental iron railing here, which was designed by George Booth. If you've taken a Cranbrook house tour, or if you have been a dedicated enough viewer of Live at 5, you know that George Booth was an ironsmith before he got into newspapers. And so he always was interested in ironworks throughout his life. Now, I mentioned with that little pavilion up there that Mario Kobel was in residence. And Kobel was a Czechoslovakian-born American sculptor. And we have a number of pieces of his inside Cranbrook House. And my favorite work of his is this edition of Dawn from 1924. She's seen here holding an apple with this beautiful draped cloth behind her. And she is sort of enclosed within the terrace between these 19th century Byzantine style carved columns. And the story goes that this stairway behind her was actually the stairway leading up to the house. When Mr. Booth expanded the terrace, the stairway became sort of enclosed underneath the terrace. The new stairs were built, and then he turned it into a fountain. And then if you continue looking down, you see the main sort of waterway with these lovely columns that were installed in the 1920s with Roman artifacts, the red Roman column capitals there at the top. And then these wonderful 18th century lion copies. So these are 20th century copies of 18th century lions designed by Antonio Canova for St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And George Booth purchased these from one of his favorite Roman galleries, the San Giorgi Gallery, which is where he got a lot of his art in Europe, in Italian art, and imported it here to Cranbrook. And you see the other lion there. Next, we will climb back up the hill. Today's tour is all about being a stairmaster. And so once George Booth had the estate sort of firmly on the side of being a gentleman's estate and not a working farm, all of these roads led to different sort of forested areas and tree groupings. And so each sort of area of the estate had a sort of peak time in which to enjoy it. And George and Ellen Booth and his father, Henry Wood Booth, as well as the children, all got lots of different ideas of things they could build on the estate. And so those included areas like the Japanese garden, which has been a previous tour, picnic houses, little stone cottage, little pergolas, and then of course the boathouse here, which is a bit overgrown and is always kept about as secure as Fort Knox with its double fence. But the boathouse, which was designed by Marcus Burroughs with significant alterations by Henry Scripps Booth, housed the family's 6 oarmen's mahogany boat that they bought on a trip to Lake Como in 1915 or 16. And that boat is still in the Cranbrook collection. Here you see the majestic sycamore towards the top of the hill, and the way that the terraces transition from the house where they're quite small and tight, and then they become more fluid until you're given this sort of natural landscape down from the hill. A very arts and crafts way of sort of transitioning from the man-made to the natural. We'll climb back up through the woods here. If anyone has any questions for me as I take you on this walk, I hope if you're not near to Cranbrook that this tour is giving you a joyous glimpse at something that's right at the start of autumn, and that is not a building, which is of course my specialty and what I show you most of the time. So I hope that a Facebook Live tour through the woods is warming your heart. Now, as we come back towards civilization, we see a pergola that was built using leftover columns from what had been a pergola closer to the house that was demolished in 1917 in order to build the Cranbrook House Library. And so George Booth was left with a surplus of these concrete columns, and he creatively reused them to build this redwood pergola that has been recently rebuilt after a tree fell on it. And then there is the glorious Sunken Garden. And Sunken Gardens date back many centuries, and large houses like Cranbrook House would have a sunken garden. Usually it would be a kitchen garden, not a flower garden. And the sunken garden is kept at a different temperature. So if Cranbrook is in sort of zone 6B, then this, by sinking the garden into the earth, it lowers it into a different growing zone. So if we were growing vegetables, which I know they have sometimes in the recent past, the vegetables would come to ready for harvest at a different time than vegetables grown outside of the sunken garden. Now, above the gate, there are 2 Fu dogs from the 18th century, Chinese dogs, one of a large set of lions and dogs that Booth had around the estate. And then across the way, we see the twin cottages, we see the greenhouse where we still grow plants from seed. And then that round tower there is missing its top piece, which would have looked very similar to these sort of Tudor half-beam constructions, but that was the original water tower for the estate. And so that was providing the water pressure back to the main house. And so here we see the main house up on the hill. Now, we are going in a circuitous route, but we've made it back to the other side of the little pavilion. I'll call it Coble House, but that is not its official name. And we see the little herb garden. Since 1971, the herb garden has been lovingly maintained by the Herb Society of Michigan. And one of my favorite features in the herb garden is the acanthus plant. And you know acanthuses from Corinthian columns. Architects have been inspired by acanthus plants since Greek times. And so the acanthus has been adapted into architectural ornament for literally millennia. And here is one that is past peak, but still identifiable as an acanthus. And then at the end of the herb garden is another sculpture by our friend Mario Kobel. This piece was originally called Atalanta, and she was sculpted in marble here in his Cranbrook studio. She was given from George Booth to the Academy of Art Museum. She stayed in the museum for a number of years, and then in the 1930s, she was given to Kingswood School for Girls, where she was placed on the dormitory porch. In 1969, a vandal pushed Atalanta over and she shattered into 1,000 pieces. She was restored at Cranbrook, and Henry Scripps Booth renamed her Ecolo, the goddess of the environment, and he composed a poem about her reconstruction, and then the goddess of the earth, rebranded, was added here to the herb garden. Also in this area, we can see the old wishing well, which is a French well with little dancing babies around it. And then above it is a work of iron. And it's quite possible that George Booth himself combined the well and the iron piece together. Again, an example of his iron work after things that he had seen in Germany. Oh, look, an acanthus popping up. And so Booth had pictures of German examples of wells with these iron covers, and then it was sort of reconstructed here. One of my favorite pictures shows George and Ellen sitting next to the well, and then behind them it is just the rolling countryside because none of the trees had been planted or grown up. Lots of lead vases and urns. Please do not ever step into a lead vase or an urn. Oh, here's the picture. Not the exact picture I was looking for, but one of the historic views of the garden before the trees had grown up, and you can see how you can see the countryside receding in the distance. I'm seeing that the instigator of the Terrace wall demolition was James Scripps Booth, the oldest son. Thank you, Tom. And James, of course, also worked on his automobiles in the garages over there. A friendly lion. And then the old service court, which is on the site of the original doghouse. The kennels were kept there. And then this east wing of Cranbrook House was the last part of the house added on. Around 1919, it featured additional guest bedrooms, but also the music room, what we know as the oak room, and then service spaces. On the porch, we see more architectural fragments, as well as more marble sculpture in this wonderful tile pattern up at the top of the brick. But we're not talking about architecture today, just the gardens. We're looking now at Menelaus, who is a Italian copy after a Roman copy of a Greek sculpture. And Menelaus was purchased by Henry Scripps Booth in 1961 or 1962 from an English auction of a Scottish estate. And then Henry added in many of the sculptures he bought at that sale. He added this one here in 1979. So the gardens have continued to evolve and grow over the years. And then looking down at the Sunken garden. Now, before we conclude our tour, I have to get to the other side of the house, which may be my favorite. So we're looking up at this majestic elm tree, which has this wonderful trumpet shape, which is why you might know many cities loved elm trees as park trees and along roadways because they have this very clear base. You can see the roots are doing practically nothing. And then the canopy is so high, it goes past any buildings. It doesn't obstruct views. And then, of course, the Dutch elm disease destroyed American cities in the 1970s and took out hundreds of elms here at Cranbrook, including all the original trees at the Academy of Art on Academy Way. But this elm tree, this amazing elm tree, and the one at the boys' school survived. And this area has just recently been cleared of its underbrush, so we're restoring some of these vistas here. Now, this area is called the Mountain, and at the top of the mountain is the Bocca della Verita, the Fontana dei Tritoni, which is a 1715 fountain that Mr. Booth purchased a reproduction of around the 1920s. And all of these evergreens were planted on the recommendation of Simmons to help stop the erosion of this little hill. And then in the corner is Weeping Zeus, which if you don't know Weeping Zeus, we'll have to wait for the water to be turned back on. Now, the reason we call this area the Mountain is actually a very late in life name change by George and Ellen Booth. They used to leave the house when they were in their elderly years, and they would say they were going around the mountain in order to get exercise. They would walk around their driveway, but if they took the driveway around this hill on level ground, it would just stay the same height, and so they would walk once around the mountain. I think it's an early example of mall walking exercise, and that is where we get the name the Mountain. Now, next we're going to head over to the West Terrace area, and this terrace is divided into 3 areas. The one closest to the library addition is here with another lawn that's looking majestically out once these 2 trees change. It is one of my favorite vistas of Cranbrook, is looking down this garden towards the trees. And there are 2 lead sculptures that were moved here in the 1950s. They used to be down by the front where the Brookside School play area is now. These sculptures were moved here, and in 2005 he got his spade back. And these are attributed to John Cheery, who was an English sculptor who worked predominantly in lead. He was actually a haberdasher by training, so I don't know if we want to study this gentleman's hat and realize how close to the correct it is. But he joined his brother, who is also a sculptor, and they did a number of equestrian statues around England. But John Cheer really made a name for himself doing picturesque garden sculptures. And so he did hundreds and hundreds of these lead garden sculptures of bucolic English scenes, very English art to do sort of gentlemen farmers and shepherds. Ours actually may have been a shepherd before he was a farmer, because in early photos it looks like he's holding a shepherd's rod, and then he's holding nothing. And so there's debate about whether he was holding a spade or a rod, but we went with the spade when he was restored. If you want to see a picture or a depiction of John Cheer's studio, in 1753, when the great English documentarian and printer Hogarth did his Analysis of Beauty series, he depicted the Hyde Park Corner sculpture yard of John Cheer. Now, across from the shepherd is his wife, the shepherd's wife, who is holding her basket. Why, as I'm looking at myself, I've somehow lost my ability to turn the camera around. There we go. So here's the shepherd's wife, again by John Cheer. And her basket was reconstructed by Venus Bronze Works in 2005. They're the metal studio that we use to clean all of our bronze and lead sculptures on campus. And so it had also gone missing. And then below the lovely library gardens, which are some of my favorites because just like my mother and sister, purple is my favorite color, and so I love all of the purple perennials that blossom from spring late into the fall here on the library walk. And then below that is another terraced garden that was added in 1911. And so in 1911, the garden just stopped here. But in 1913, under Simmons' direction, George Booth connected what had been actually a sort of intermediate hill, and he flattened from that hill all the way to here to build the Grand West Terrace. And in 1913, it was simply a single terrace. And in 1914, the first Oakland County Dog Show was held here by Florence Booth, one of the daughters. And then in the 1920s, George Booth envisioned that instead of just being a terraced lawn, he would transform it into what he called a terrace of the arts, blending architecture, sculpture, and music. And so to commemorate sort of the arts and music, he commissioned this sculpture by Mario Kobel, sometimes known as Harmony, other times as Music, and sometimes as Sonata. She is sort of strumming her lyre, staring up at the heavens, and then in front of her water splashes up. It is really just a wonderful work of sculpture here on the campus. And then more gardens. In Ellen Booth's time, I believe that she kept these her favorite colors, mauve and white, but today they have a sort of yellow, orange, and purple color scheme planting. And then the fountain, of course, opens all the way back towards, I think, the last thing that we'll look at today, which is Eric Franchi measuring things, I think. There is our PR person and House and Gardens extraordinaire, Eric. Hello. And we see the last fountain down here, the Cherub Fountain, which was installed in May of 1915 in this great semicircular base. And you see the way that the water sort of flies off the cherub, past the dolphins, onto this three-part shell base. And since the fountain is drained, we can get close and we can actually see that these are shells. And what I've always appreciated about this fountain is that when the water is running, the water sort of just comes straight off. It feels very serene, very modern to me to have the sort of water drip flat down onto these flat surfaces and then flat down onto this great sort of flat semicircle that has recently been rebuilt. I'm looking forward to whatever year that we can turn the fountains back on and have the water sort of bubbling all around Cranbrook. And then we can look back at the house situated into its great hill. Now, of course, there are hundreds of other things that I could have shown you in Cranbrook House and Gardens. This stairway was actually added quite late in the game, so I am grateful to it when I do go to the office, because this is how I get from my apartment on Academy Way to my office in Cranbrook House. And once this stairway was built, it then was connecting to the art museum and the ramp of the Chinese dog straight ahead. So as I was saying, I could have mentioned tens of thousands of facts or other sort of interesting tidbits about Cranbrook House and Gardens. It's a fascinating landscape to explore. There's a phone app that you can use to check out the gardens and do a self-guided tour. You're also welcome to just come, enjoy, explore the gardens, explore the woods that remain, and just take in the sort of fall air and the fall colors. I'm grateful to my colleague Eric Franchi and my friends over at the Cranbrook House and Gardens for letting me come over and do this little Live at 5 tours. And all of Cranbrook is grateful to the garden sponsors who enable us to maintain these gardens through their financial donations. And those include PNC Bank, Robert's Restaurant Group, Go Eat at Bill's or Get It to Go, and Fleur Detroit, who of course are also donating so much to our restoration of the Frank Lloyd Wright House landscape. So thank you to our sponsors. The gardens will continue to be open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. into the fall. You can park at the Cranbrook parking lot, which used to be a meadow. Please be respectful of our grounds. We don't encourage picnicking, we don't like dogs, and we don't encourage bike riding. This is a garden that is best appreciated in serenity and on foot. So I don't know if anyone had any other questions. This was certainly the most I've ever walked up and down hills on camera. So I hope that you have enjoyed this live at 5. I have no idea what time it is. The question about will we see the Greek theater, because that is technically part of the garden. I was not planning on showing it, but we can actually just see it through the woods. The Greek theater being the booth's first public area of Cranbrook, and where they put on plays to help moralize the community as part of the Little Theater movement in the early 20th century. Next week, I'll be back for another Live at 5 here on Facebook on Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern. On Tuesday, I will broadcast Live at 5 on Instagram at Cranbrook Center. And then on October 27th, I'll be delivering another Uncovering Cranbrook virtual lecture about Eero Saarinen and his designs and study at Yale. So we'll progress up through the woods, so lovingly planted by Simmons and Booth, and I shall end our happy tour up here in the Greek theater, which, if you can picture the sort of ideal of Mount Olympus, where you have all of these dense evergreen pine trees, and then the sort of white walls and the white columns in this sort of glade of the gods. Persephone by Marshall Fredericks, added by Henry Scripps Booth in the 1970s. The Actors' Court, where you would get dressed. And then, of course, the actual Greek theater here. And this being the sort of grandest of the follies within the garden, and where we still put on theater productions, graduation, theater camp, all different sorts of purposes and uses of the Greek theater. I hope that you enjoyed this Live at 5 tour, a look at Cranbrook Gardens and at my hair as it gradually flies away. I will see you all next week. Be safe, wear a mask, and I will see you next time.